From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman, the man who will be taking over for Kathy Griffin on CNN's Rockin' New Year's Eve with Anderson Cooper.
I was hoping for real time with Bill Maher, but I'll take that.
Okay, very good. Today, we are going to do a little something different than the normal politics. We're going to take a very deep dive into a consumer issue everyone should know about, especially if you've ever had or know anyone who has had hernia surgery. Listen closely, because there is a procedure out there that uses a particular mesh device that has the potential to cause a lot of problems. And in fact, I know somebody personally who has an ongoing horrific experience with this. We are going to discuss that with Jane Akre, founder and editor of the Mesh Medical News Desk. We'll also be joined by hernia surgeon Dr. Robert Bendavid from Ralph's favorite hospital, the Shouldice Hospital in Toronto, Canada. But let's first introduce Dr. Robert Bendavid. He is a leading hernia surgeon and past president and a founding father of the American Hernia Society. Dr. Bendavid has performed thousands of procedures and is presently associated with the Shouldice Hospital in Toronto. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Robert Bendavid.
Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Bendavid, let me put this overall subject for our listeners in a broader context. The Johns Hopkins School of Medicine put out a report about a year ago estimating conservatively 250,000 fatalities in hospitals due to hospital-induced infections, hospital malpractice, hospital errors, misprescription of drugs, conditions that they thought were preventable. That comes down to 5,000 people on the average a week in the United States who lose their life in hospitals because of what is going on in these hospitals. And we know there's some hospitals trying to deal rigorously with reducing the sources of infection, etc. Johns Hopkins study is not the only one. Over 25 years ago, the Harvard School of Public Health physicians had a study which estimated almost 100,000 people dying in hospitals just due to hospital-based malpractice. It has been called the third leading cause of preventable death in America, and it is at an epidemic level. I give this context because today we're going to zero in on a specific arena of commercial and medical malpractice involving the repair of hernias. We have a great expert who is a surgeon as well as a person who knows what's going on in the corporate as well in the medical and hospital world, associated with the Shouldice Hospital right outside Toronto, Ontario. So let's start, Dr. Bendavid, with the definition of a hernia, and there are several kinds of hernias. What is a hernia, and how many people get operations in the United States in a given year?
Well, the definition, which is essentially accepted by all the surgeons, is really the protrusion of a visceral organ through a defect in the abdominal wall. And the wall does have areas that tend to form them. The groin is certainly one of them. The umbilicus is another one. The flanks can be as well. The midline also. So this is by definition any protrusion of viscus. It can be anything, a large bowel, small bowel. And there are, certainly according to the latest figures, about 1 million hernia operations done in the United States, probably about 800,000 of them being inguinal hernias, as opposed to abdominal wall, anterior abdominal wall surgery, incisional hernias or ventral hernias.
How do we get a hernia? What are the various causes? Because there may be 1 million operations on hernia repair in the U.S., but a lot more people have incipient hernias, if there's such a thing, or actual hernias, but they're not facing much pain, and so they don't go and get it repaired. So what are the causes?
Well, the causes are divided into two classes. One are the congenital that you can see with the indirect inguinal hernias. The direct ones, which are a different type, also in the groin, are probably secondary to a collagen disease, and this is what we've been talking about and researching to explain the two complete theories about them, and they're totally different and treated also very differently. For example, an indirect inguinal hernia, if you resect it and do absolutely nothing else, the repair will be just as good as anything that can ever be done. Whereas with a direct, most of the time you can manage it very well with a pure tissue repair. Only if they're really large or associated with a femoral hernia will they need a mesh. It's rare, but it can.
Well, then now we're going to get to the nub of the problem. That is the use of artificial meshes in hernia repairs. There are a number of corporations that manufacture and sell them. They come in different ingredients, and there's a lot of litigation involved by wrongfully injured people filing tort claims in the United States. There are a lot of settlements. The settlements and the verdicts have totaled hundreds of millions of dollars.
Exactly.
This is an area of preventable violence that is almost never written on by the mass media, which is otherwise preoccupied these days. So before we learn about the Shouldice method of repairing hernias, a word about the Shouldice Clinic right outside Toronto in Ontario, Canada. For over 70 years, the Shouldice Clinic has been the gold standard for hernia repair around the world. It has been discussed in peer-reviewed medical journals most favorably. It has been the subject of a Harvard Business School case study for the efficiency and the responsiveness to patient needs that the hospital has exhibited. Other business schools also have had case studies. And Shouldice physicians have published information and data about the Shouldice method and statistics about how effective it's been in reducing recurrence and infections subsequent to the operation in peer-reviewed medical journals. So let me ask you, Dr. Bendavid, you have been surveying this situation and you have been speaking about the Shouldice method for many, many years.
Right.
Tell our listeners, what is this method? When a patient comes to your hospital with a hernia needing a repair, how is it done?
Well, the operation is essentially a simple one. It consists of making a skin incision and dissecting deeper until you come to the layers of the abdominal wall, which have to also be incised, and you identify next the types of hernias. You can have certainly three major ones and others that are rare, but the operation allows you to discover any possible hernias within the area, because what we do, which all the other operations do not do, is we get into the preperitoneal space by dividing the posterior wall of what's called the inguinal canal. And this is the key, which is not a very easy step, but actually once you've done it a dozen times, it does become easy. There have been about 80 imitations of the operation, but not one of them get into the preperitoneal space, and this is what makes them all fail.
How do you do these hernia repairs with very minimal use of mesh?
Yeah, the repairs are done by approximating good tissues, because in the two types of repair, the indirect one, it never presents any problem in terms of availability of tissues to close the area. That's never a problem. The only time there may be a problem is when you have a big direct inguinal hernia, and even then we can manage it pretty well. It's very rare that we will use mesh. We will probably talk about it in a moment, because there has been a phenomenal review of 250,000 cases done in Ontario, and we'll talk about it later on.
Yes. Well, listeners should understand that this is a repair hernia method that uses your natural tissue.
Exactly. Pure, what we call pure tissue or natural tissues, your own natural tissues.
Instead of putting a synthetic mesh in your body. You've been very critical of the practice that is prevailing in the United States, where putting mesh in is the preferred approach, not the physician-trained ability to use natural tissue. Can you describe the scene and why you're so concerned about it in terms of the well-being of millions of American patients?
Well, it needs to be emphasized, actually, and the best example is last year there was a study done by the University of Toronto, and they reviewed 215,000 cases of operations done over a period of 14 years and followed up for 14 years within Ontario. And they stacked the Shouldice Hospital against all the other hospitals in Ontario. And it turned out that the recurrence rate for all the hospitals of Ontario was 5%, whereas at the Shouldice Hospital it was 1%. However, the study never included us directly. We didn't even know about this study. When they published that Shouldice Hospital did 28% of all the surgery in Ontario, we were quite stunned, and they didn't have any information at all as to what we're doing here. And my study now is to follow the 70,000 cases to see what kind of a recurrence we've had, and besides the recurrence rate, the problems such as pain. And this is what we're reporting on right now, and also the use of mesh. Out of the 70,000 cases of patients that we've done, we've used mesh in only 1.3%, as opposed to 100% that is being used all over the place now. In North America, in Canada, in Europe, everybody is using mesh. There is an abuse of the material, and the industry has done very much to push it.
Well, there's a profit motive involved here. Obviously, they can charge more for hernia repair operations using mesh. Also, they don't have to have as skilled surgeons, which is needed as the physicians at Shouldice Clinic in Canada possess to use natural tissue repair. So what is the level of morbidity here around the United States? 100%, almost 100% of all hernia operations, with a few exceptions, you say, are using this synthetically fabricated mesh that they
Absolutely.
put in. And what kind of recurrence rate and infection rate is there in the United States? Do you have any estimates for that?
Well, certainly the recurrence rate right now, the United States or Canada has about the same results, and we have to take the latest numbers that came from this big series as 5%. Often they claim it's 2 to 3, 4%, but those are the figures. With reference to infection, it's another issue. It depends on the hospital. In our hospital here at Shouldice Hospital, we do not admit any cases of infections, for example, patients with a pneumonia or an appendicitis. Any infected cases would not be admitted here. So we don't have what we call nosocomial infections. It doesn't exist, and this is why we have such very low incidence of infection here.
Well, in the United States, thousands of patients who have been harmed by botched hernia repair operations suffer incredible pain, and then they have to take a lot of drugs which have side effects, or they go from one doctor to another trying to figure out how to ameliorate their suffering. Thousands of them have found lawyers. There have been class actions. There have been settlements. There have been verdicts. The FDA, yes, the Food and Drug Administration has been quite lax here. Anytime there's a lawsuit, it's federal law requires that it be reported to the Food and Drug Administration. And a lot of these lawsuits are not being reported to the Food and Drug Administration, which is now being run by a former drug industry consultant and board member of various drug companies, Dr. Gottlieb. So we're not looking forward to a significant improvement in regulation of this mesh epidemic of malpractice. Why is the medical profession in the United States, whose members specialize in these hernia repairs, not willing to concede that the Shouldice method is better, it is safer, it has a much, much lower recurrence rate, and by the way, the operation is much less expensive in Canada than hernia repair operations in the U.S.? Why do hernia repair surgeons have their backup in the United States and are not willing to do, as scientists, what Alfred North Whitehead described as leaving open options for revision, and they continue with their mesh mania?
Well, there are certainly two answers to this. Number one, the industry has been spending a lot of money training people and doing nothing but sending them to various seminars so they can learn how to use mesh. And they've been able to harness various departments providing money for research, whereas the pure tissue repair, the natural tissue repair, has essentially no one to support them except the Shouldice Hospital. And this is a very big issue. Who is going to support the pure tissue repair when the industry is actually creating schools? And in Europe now, they're planning on 3 schools being opened simply to teach the use of mesh. They often accuse the fact that the Shouldice repair is a difficult operation. It's not, because if it were difficult, no one would want to do it. And certainly laparoscopic surgery, for example, takes a lot longer to learn, and it's also not a safe technique in everyone's hand.
Dr. Bendavid, let's talk about the nature of the operation. People who go to Shouldice stay a few days to be checked up, to make sure that the operation is working very well. Where in the United States, sometimes it's in and out in one day, and they go home. Could you describe the treatment of patients who go to Shouldice Clinic for hernia repair operation?
Well, they usually check in the night before, and the surgery is usually scheduled the next morning, and they're discharged anywhere between 48 to 72 hours. I think it's an important period because if you were to send a patient home often, they may stay in bed, they may not be active, whereas here, for 3 days, they do exercises under supervision, and they're active. They have to get up and go for lunch, supper. It's a climate of camaraderie between them, and it seems to help them, whereas if you did let them go, they may end up in bed and with all kinds of complications, such as thrombophlebitis and respiratory problems. We do know this, and in a sense, it's really not much of an imposition on a patient to take 2 to 3 days from their life to make sure that when they leave here, they can actually go back to normal activities.
It's the closest thing to a vacation. I've experienced it myself. You have beautiful grounds. You have walkways where people can start walking. The steps are not high. People go by beautiful flowers and shrubbery. They make new acquaintances and friends. And you have people who have the same problem. who
Exactly. They commiserate.
They commiserate with one another. They have 3 good meals a day. And all of this costs less than the operation in the United States, where you're often in and out in the same day.
Absolutely. Yes. Some people bring their spouses, and with the cost of the hotel, and it's still cheaper.
Now, what do you think needs to be done? I know that patients are organizing. The legendary patient Bruce Rosenberg, who suffered enormously for years from a botched hernia operation. He went to 40 different physicians. He had to take all kinds of drugs with side effects, and he became an expert in this area. And he has started the National Meshoma Foundation, that's MESHOMA, that focuses on research, education, and outreach. And he will be very pleased to receive any kind of comment or inquiry, people who are concerned about their hernia condition and a hernia operation and coming out well from it. Now, I have never seen a situation of blanket malpractice for profit and for speed of the operation be so little challenged, both by government officials in the U.S., the Food and Drug Administration, state regulatory agencies, by professional societies who should know better, and above all, by the media, including the specialized medical media. Jane Brody writes a weekly column, and has for decades, for the New York Times. And if she does an article on the synthetic mesh epidemic in the United States, things will start to happen. So listeners, if you're concerned with this, and we want to get something changed here, we don't want to just get informed, her email is inquiries@Jane Brody, that's BRODY.net. That's inquiries@janebrody.net. And urge her to do a column on this. She has the most preeminent health advisory column in the country. And when she speaks, people listen. And she knows about the situation from past articles that she's written, but never directly on the medical malpractice that's involved in the profit motive and the litigation. Dr. Bendavid, what do you see as the coming years here? Are the patients going to be given more like the Schuldice method? Are there any doctors in the United States that use the Schuldice method who trained at your clinic?
Very few. However, this is very relevant right now because I just came back from a meeting in Vienna of the European Hernia Society, and we are actually involved in survival battle here, if we want to identify it as such, because the European Society has set up what they've called world guidelines. And there has been a group organizing from Schuldice as well as other American surgeons who are very strongly against all those guidelines, because guidelines essentially are promoting mesh for everyone, especially women. And women are supposed, according to the guidelines, to have laparoscopic surgery with mesh in all cases, even though women have about 65 to 70% of indirect inguinal hernias, which means they would never need mesh. And so we're fighting these. Another one is the fact that they start putting mesh in people at the age of 18. Now, if an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old has a mesh on both sides, by the time he's 30 years old, he may never have a family that he may be contemplating. And a lot of the problems with reports nowadays is that they are very short. After 6 months, they feel that they can predict that the formation of sperm is normal. It's not going to be normal in 10 years. And what the incidence is, we don't know, but certainly we have learned that it can happen 10 to 15 and 20 years later. So there is an abuse of a material whose behavior we're not familiar with yet. Very often you will read that it has been used since the late 50s, but in fact, it has not been in circulation since the early 90s. So we really only have 20 to 25 years, and some of the pathology takes that long.
Well, the mesh is considered a medical device under U.S. law, and it's supposed to be regulated, but the Food and Drug Administration underregulates medical devices even less than they regulate pharmaceuticals. So we have a Food and Drug Administration problem here. We have Senator Richard Blumenthal and others who are consumer advocates in the Senate who should be appraised of this situation. Have you been interviewed much by U.S. media, and have you been asked to testify as an expert at any hearings, administrative or legislative, over the years, Dr. Bendavid?
Not so far. I've never wanted particularly to be involved, but now it seems that we are being dragged into it simply because no one is here to defend patients. And we're beginning. As a matter of fact, the evidence last year, there was a case in Maryland, I believe, where a woman was assigned damages of $135 million, and our group actually acted in her defense.
Describe what the mesh is made of and how large is it?
The mesh can be any size you want, really. The biggest is probably 20 to 30 centimeters. You can have it pretty much to any size that you wish. However, for the purpose of the groin, it comes in 10 by 15 centimeters, 4 to 6 inches. It's made of polypropylene, most of it. Most of the meshes are made of polypropylene, since it is the one that's causing the problems. Now they're making it lighter by weight with bigger pores, hoping to reduce the problems, but in fact, the problem is still the same.
And what are the names of some of the chief corporations in this business?
Well, the big ones are Ethicon, which is a branch of Johnson & Johnson, Bard, Covidien. Those are probably the biggest ones on the market nowadays. Medtronic is another.
And what are the names of the insurance companies that are involved here? They're paying out for these verdicts and settlements. Shouldn't they be interested in loss prevention? Shouldn't they be guardians of safer practices?
Well, it's interesting, but I've learned from Bruce, actually, Rosenberg, that a couple of U.S. states were trying to recoup some of the monies that were spent on the treatment of complications, which is far larger than the money spent on the original surgery. And certainly, Bruce would be far more informed on that issue.
Well, we're going to have Bruce Rosenberg on in a subsequent program. This mesh hernia repair epidemic is just illustrative of what a low priority both our government and our media have accorded what has been considered the third leading cause of preventable death in America, and that is due to poor practices, malpractice in hospitals, hospital-induced infections, bad prescriptions of pharmaceuticals and their combination, and other what are euphemistically called medical errors. Now, we really would like to do something about this more systematically and get more media. Let me ask you a final question, Dr. Bendavid. Why are these companies and the medical profession that specializes in hernia so aggressive, so antagonistic? They try to go after doctors who practice Scholdice method. Is it because they feel they're guilty? I've never seen such aggressive defamation, if you will, of people who are pursuing an alternative, safer, more efficient, more honest way to repair hernias.
Well, if you remember Upton Sinclair, he once said it's difficult to have a man understand something when his income depends on not understanding it.
Yes.
If you see what I'm trying to say. So it's a source of income. This is their bailiwick money, and I don't think they care much what's happening. As a matter of fact, this is what it seems to be. They are ready to pay whatever damages need to be paid. In the meantime, they're still raking in billions of dollars. The other thing, too, is there's something wrong with the FDA in terms of proving the 510K. Anything made of polypropylene seems to be quite acceptable, when in fact it's not. Even if you have to use mesh, there is no need ever to use anything but a simple sheet of mesh. There's probably close to 200 gadgets that are being sold, which complicates life very, very much, because when they need to be removed, it becomes a big problem. And this is why a lot of the surgeons refuse to go in to remove the meshes, because it can be a difficult proposition, especially when it's a gadget. If it's a simple sheet, it's a lot easier. And I've always felt that any surgery that's being done ought to be reversible if it should become necessary for it to be reversible. And the 510K, since all gadgets are made with polypropylene, should not be automatically allowed on the market.
Dr. Bendavid, when is the next meeting of the American Hernia Society in the United States? And is it open for non-specialized visitors known as patients?
I don't imagine they would refuse anyone that wants to attend. And that the next one, I believe, is being held in March in Miami, Florida. It's a combined meeting with the Europeans.
And that's where the manufacturers have exhibition booths. That's where the specialists, the surgeons who work on hernia repair, come, and that's where technical papers are presented. Are they responsive to technical papers from Scholdice surgeons and researchers?
We don't submit. Normally, we prefer being invited, like any institution or a surgeon worth his salt. We simply wait to be invited to come and speak. Otherwise, we're quite busy, and it's not a matter of coming to present unless we have something that is unusual to present, new method or whatever. But generally speaking, it's by invitation.
And have you been invited over the years at these annual meetings of the American Hernia?
Many times. I have been invited many times, except much less so since the mesh industry has taken over.
Well, thank you very much. We've been talking with Dr. Robert Bendavid, a leading hernia surgeon with the Scholdice Clinic outside Toronto, Canada, the world's gold standard for hernia repair, documented in many medical journals, and the actual statistics of how patients are treated when they go there and how consistently safe the practice is compared to other hospitals in North America who use the mesh method of hernia repair surgery. How would people get in touch with Shouldice Hospital if they want to get more information or they want to go there for a hernia repair? Doctor?
Actually, online, you can simply type Shouldice Hospital, and all the information will be available. They will be able to correspond or to phone or to call, and I think the lines of communication are quite open and quite excellent here.
That's the Shouldice Hospital, Shouldice, in Thornhill, Ontario, right outside of Toronto, Ontario, Canada.
Right. The zip code is L3T4A3.
And I can assure you, you will be treated with great respect and great skill by very committed surgeons who are pursuing this superior way of hernia repair for very modest salaries. Thank you very much, Dr. Bendavid.
We've been speaking with Dr. Robert Bendavid, hernia surgeon at Shouldice Hospital in Toronto. And now we're going to turn to Jane Akre. David?
Jane Akre is the founder and editor of the Mesh Medical Device News Desk. She has been a journalist for nearly 30 years, working as a broadcaster, anchor, and reporter at stations all around the country, as well as over at CNN. Ms. Akre has won numerous awards, including the Society of Professional Journalists Award for Ethics, as well as the Goldman Prize, North America 2001 for Environmental Reporting. She and her husband successfully challenged News Corp after trying to suppress a story about synthetic bovine growth hormone produced by Monsanto and used in much of the nation's dairy supply. That whistleblowing lawsuit was featured in the documentary The Corporation. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jane Akre.
Thanks so much for having me and for discussing this important topic. I appreciate it.
Welcome indeed. Jane Akre, you have started in the summer of 2011 a news service, a specialized news service to deal with the subject of complications associated with surgical mesh operations. You're not affiliated with any of the interested parties on any side. You are a straight news editor providing information about what's going on in this country and other countries regarding this situation. You were prompted into this kind of work by something the Food and Drug Administration did in 2011. Can you explain what that was?
I went to an expert panel that was gathered in September of 2011 to look at this issue of polypropylene mesh used transvaginally. That's what they were focused on at the time. And a bunch of panelists were there, 20 people or so, many of them with ties to industry. And industry was there, had a very heavy presence. Industry was allowed to present its point of view for as long as they wanted to, but mostly women and people who had been affected by the mesh were allowed to speak for, 2 minutes or 5 minutes. There was a clock running, and they were cut off even mid-sentence. And I thought, well, this is ridiculous. Many of the panelists we knew had taken money from industry to do research, and it just didn't seem like it was an even-handed look at this issue. The FDA was already not dealing with the number of reports that had come in to the agency, and that in itself is a problem. But obviously there were a lot of injuries, and the FDA wasn't there to address it.
But the Food and Drug Administration, Jane Akre, did issue an explicit warning to the public, did it not, in 2011?
Yes, you're right.
And what was the nature of that warning? What was the nature of that warning?
In 2008, the FDA said that these mesh injuries were rare. And in 2011, it issued a safety communication that reversed itself and now said that these injuries that were being reported were not rare. And that was huge because that opened the floodgates to all kinds of litigation then and the mass torts that ensued.
Can you give us an idea of the range of litigation here, settlements, verdicts? We're talking about thousands and thousands of patients in our country who have had these adverse effects, many of them suffering year after year with great pain and having to take drugs with not good side effects that don't seem to deal with the problem either. They get into a vortex of desperate seeking treatment and relief. Could you describe the only activity seems to be going on in this country to hold these corporations who sell the mesh product and others accountable?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think we really know the scope of injuries. Unless you're online, and many people are not, hard to believe, but maybe some older Americans are not online, they're being told things like, well, you're just getting older, that you have to expect this. So in January of 2012, multi-district litigation was formed in Charleston, West Virginia to deal with 1,000 or so cases that were coming in. That MDL now has swelled to 102,000 cases, and there are various state courts where there are state MDLs. There's probably about 140 or so defective product cases filed around the country, most of them in Charleston, West Virginia, where they're consolidated. And there have been very few bellwether trials. A bellwether is supposed to sort of gauge the legal theories and the causation and the degree of injury and whether the device actually caused that person's injury. There's only been, I think there have been maybe 6 or 8 of these bellwether cases. And they were supposed to lead to settlements where both sides would sit down. They were encouraged to do so by the judge and come up with some reasonable amount of money that would be close to making the woman whole. Well, that didn't happen. The settlements that are now coming down the pike, I saw one the other day for $164. And for that money, the woman signs away her rights to ever pursue this case again, and she's not allowed to discuss it. Of course, she discussed it with me, but...
These are class actions.
Well, it's MDL. It's
multi-district
like
litigation.
A class action. It's based on the degree of injury. So they come up with a tier of injury. If you had 3 revisions, you're in a higher tier than someone who had no revisions. So that's the theory, is that, number of revisions in itself is sort of a flawed formula, because what if the woman didn't have the money to go and get a revision surgery? She is just going to be awarded less money in any kind of a settlement. That's where we are right now, mass settlements and very little money. And in most cases, from what I see, the law firms are walking away with more money than the injured woman.
Well, this is one of the problems of these class actions, that they put the plaintiff lawyer into a conflict situation by offering a sizable fee and a non-adequate settlement for the patients. On the other hand, these corporations drag the litigation on for years and years while people are suffering. So some of the plaintiff lawyers say, well, better a smaller amount now than wait for some hypothetical larger amount later. That's why some of the law firms don't do class actions in this area. The Hollis law firm says that they just take one patient at a time and file a case. Give us an idea of the dollar value of these verdicts and settlements over the last 10 years, such as we know about them.
Yeah, the cases that have gone to trial have, when the juries listen to the evidence, the plaintiffs are awarded a decent settlement. They're still not made whole. What is the price of your health? But I've seen everything from $1 million up to $100 million in one Texas jury that was later reduced under tort reform to about half. But the most recent cases were $2 million and $20 million. That's in the last couple of months. And the ones that are awarded punitive damages, which are, of course, meant to punish the company, are more than the compensatory damages. The $20 million case, for example, it was $17 million in punitive damages against Ethicon, which is a division of Johnson & Johnson, and $3 million in compensatory damages. So the juries are listening to this information, and they are getting angry, and they are sending a clear and, I wish it was convincing message to the firms, to the manufacturers, that they need to stop this behavior. But it isn't really slowing down Johnson & Johnson. There are 182 cases that are getting ready to be heard in the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas. There are some in New Jersey that are coming up. And J&J seems to be playing some kind of game of chicken or something. I don't understand what their end game is.
To some of these, Jane Akre, it's the cost of doing business. They're insured, and the profits are so spectacular from selling the mesh that they don't change their way of doing business. What are some of the insurance companies that are involved on the side of the manufacturers here, and why don't they engage in loss control? Why don't they poke around and say, look, we're tired of paying out these verdicts and settlements on your behalf, corporation. Clean up your act.
You would think so, wouldn't you? I mean, if you could avoid paying $17 million, wouldn't you want to? I don't know what they're thinking. I also don't know what the shareholders are thinking. Why not hold these companies accountable for these losses? In April, I went to the J&J shareholders meeting to see what was going on there. And, you know, they have these wonderful video presentations, and the keywords were sustainability and putting patients first. And I happened to talk to one of the counsel for Johnson & Johnson. He didn't know who I was. And I said, you know, since sustainability is your message here and you keep losing in court, is there a mass settlement, perhaps a global settlement in the works? And he looked at me like I had just grown another head. He said, and you are? And he was very annoyed at that question, but I think I found the right person to ask it of, but he turned around and walked away. But I don't understand what goes on.
We've been talking with Jane Akre, who started this news service called the Mesh News Desk, often known as the Mesh Medical Device News Desk. Let's assume you're speaking on behalf of the other side, which of course you don't do. But what would be the argument of the manufacturers saying that their mesh is safe, and all these trials where there's cross-examination and evidence do not persuade us to do anything else but continue to sell this petroleum-based product that is leading to such a large number of recurrences, pain, and botched operations? What is their defense?
Well, that's a really good question. It's always good to get into the mind of the other side. I think that, and they have in court argued, well, we are compliant with the FDA's Section 510K evaluation process. We have marketed our devices that are substantially similar to other devices already on the market, and we did so with the FDA's approval. It's actually the FDA's clearance for marketing, but they don't put it that way. So we have followed all the rules that are required of us, and we did our testing on the product. I mean, they put it in a few animals, and they used it in a few cadavers, and, you know, neither of them complained. So the other thing they use is that polypropylene suture has been used in hernia repair since the 1950s. It's been proven to be safe for decades and decades. It's been used in millions of people. And they've actually, in court, tried to compare a ProLift mesh, which is a rather large piece of mesh about the size of your hand with arms that come out that lock into the body. They've tried to compare that and its danger to suture, which is a thread, you know, and that fell on deaf ears. That comparison was ridiculous, of course. But since polypropylene suture has been on the market and has been used successfully for many, many years, it's essentially the same thing. I guess that's the argument I try to make.
Yeah. Well, reliance on the FDA's legendary laxness in this area is really their only face to the public. And the FDA's regulation of medical devices has been weak beyond a farce, and they've grandfathered a lot of devices as a result. Let's put it in another way. Have the promoters of the mesh industry ever been willing to debate openly with the critics like Dr. Bendavid and others who have documented the harm of these petroleum-based mesh products?
Not that I've ever seen, no.
Has there been a congressional hearing or a state legislative hearing on the subject?
No, there hasn't, and there should be.
And when they settle these suits, they force the patients in the settlement to shut up and sign a gag order? Is that a uniform practice by these corporations
Absolutely.
and their corporate lawyers?
Non-disclosure clauses with every one of these contracts to settle, absolutely. There's just one other thing. I mean, if the woman doesn't have, let's say she takes $25,000 and she doesn't have a problem now, but a year from now, all of a sudden she does have problems because mesh isn't, inert in the body. It takes on a life of its own. So she's forever precluded from ever filing any kind of action again. That's it. It's the end.
Well, there's an FDA regulation that requires that when a company is sued, it notifies the Food and Drug Administration of the lawsuit. Is that being observed by these corporations?
I can't tell you that I know the answer to that.
Well, the information that I've received is that there is underreporting and that the FDA is not much of a federal cop on the corporate mesh beat, so to speak. What are the names of some of the companies here? The manufacturers, the insurance companies?
The manufacturers, the largest mesh manufacturer is Ethicon, which is Johnson & Johnson. And there's Boston Scientific, there is American Medical Systems, there is C.R. Bard, Coloplast, Cook, and Neomedic. Those are the 7 that are listed in the MDL in West Virginia.
And do they use the same type of material, or do they have different synthetic materials for their mesh?
It's all polypropylene, which is a cheap plastic. It's used in the top of tic-tac boxes and indoor-outdoor carpeting. Each one of them has a somewhat proprietary treatment to that mesh. They sterilize it. They may put some kind of coating on it. But it's all basically made up of polypropylene, which, as you said, is a petroleum product.
How do you manage to get your information? There's so much enforced secrecy here, and there's not much government investigations, not to mention investigations that are made public by the Food and Drug Administration. How do you get your information for your group, the Mesh News Desk?
I go to trials, and I sit there and I listen to the evidence. I've sat in a number of them, and, there's a world of information that's filed with these complaints. Some of it is confidential that I probably shouldn't be seeing, but it's very revealing. And, I just put it all on the website.
Well, fortunately, we still have open courtrooms with transcripts, and the press is able to cover these trials. How have the plaintiff law firms been behaving, in your opinion?
The ones that take the cases to trial have been doing a great job. I mean, they're, very aggressive, and that's probably the reason that they've had these plaintiff verdicts and the huge punitive damages. But there's a whole kind of subset of lawyers out there that I've learned about, and these are the ones that have the reputation that they deserve, I'm afraid, where they're working basically warehousing cases. Everybody's seen the 800 numbers on late-night television about transvaginal mesh, and there were legal referral services that were gathering huge numbers of women, answering these late-night ads, and basically putting them in a mass, preparing them for settlement. They were never worked up for trial. In some cases, their cases were never even filed. And so, the lawyers are settling these cases in mass and just kind of telling the women, this is the best you're going to get, sign it, and that's it, we'll be done with you.
And when they get these cases and they settle them under a gag order of secrecy, do they apply that gag order to themselves, these plaintiff lawyers, after they settle, or do they speak out? Do they call reporters? Do they try to get something regulated and prevented?
No, not at all. I mean, they're making a lot of money, and they're taking 40%. Now, from what I've learned, if you don't work a case up for trial, you really not do 40%. You might get 33 1/3. 40% is when you start working a case up for trial and it settles. But they're taking 40%. And expenses, and, I don't know what your expenses are really. I'm not a lawyer, so it's not fair for me to judge that. But in some cases, thousands of dollars of expenses when all they've done is get medical records.
Well, first of all, 40% is beyond the range. It's outrageous. Usually you hit the 40% after you've won the case, challenged for an appeal. You go up to the appeal, the Supreme Court, the state briefs. When you have basically the evidence at hand and you know there's going to be a settlement, you shouldn't even take 1/3. of that. So what we're seeing here is some law firms are pretty honest, straightforward. They take these cases individually. Others are into the class action mill, as it's called, and they get to know their countering lawyers who represent Johnson & Johnson and other companies, and they get pretty friendly with them. And so these are often what we call sweetheart settlements. They're not quite as bad as the settlements with the airlines in return for vouchers while the plaintiff lawyers got a dollar fee, but that's part of the problem. And what do you see in terms of future reform here? What are the possibilities and where and by who?
Well, that's a really good question. The POP mesh, pelvic organ prolapse mesh, and that's the larger one that's the size of your hand, has been reclassified by the FDA as a Class 3 medical device, and they're giving them until next year to finalize that. But that means they must undergo clinical trials. That is going to be the end of it because they're not going to spend the money to do the clinical trials, and they wouldn't pass the clinical trials anyway, even if they did. So that kind of mesh will not be on the market anymore. So doctors are going to have to be trained in some of the old-fashioned repair techniques, which they probably should have done in many of these cases anyway. So I believe that's progress in terms of patient health. A Class 2 medical device is the problem. Class 2 doesn't require clinical trials. It can pass through the 510K, clearance for market. Here's a few $1,000s, and in exchange of paperwork, it might take 90 days. Boom, you can market your device. And the FDA doesn't require anything. That's where the FDA needs to look at. Implantable, permanent medical devices cannot be Class 2, in my opinion. And I think most Americans would agree with that.
How about the patient movement? Bruce Rosenberg has started a group made up of patients. Is that beginning to have some sort of impact? He started the National Meshoma, M-E-S-H-O-M-A, Foundation.
Well, I wish that there was more done. Bruce was one of the people at the shareholders meeting of Johnson & Johnson. But you have to consider many of these people are so injured they can't travel, and many of them can't work, so they have no money to travel. Some are even losing their homes. So you've got really kind of a group, a very passionate group, but a very injured group. So it's going to take, advocates who just raise their voice and say, this has got to change. The whole system is wrong, medically, and, of course, the legal system has got the problems as well.
This looks like a good subject for 60 Minutes, CBS 60 Minutes, Sunday evening. Listeners, you want to tap into their email and tell them to get going on this. This seems to be perfectly suited for their kind of investigative journalism. Have you filed many freedom of information requests with the Food and Drug Administration? Because according to some material by Bruce Rosenberg's group, the Office of Criminal Investigation of the Food and Drug Administration opened some time ago an investigation against several larger manufacturers to determine if polypropylene could degrade the body. And apparently that investigation is going nowhere, but it was opened and it would be subject to a freedom of information request if it is not pending. The pending cases are exempted from freedom of information request, but if it's going nowhere, it's basically closed. You can get more information about that. But do you use the Free Information Act in that way?
I don't. I just find it fairly useless because they can say to you, I'm sorry, we're not going to provide that information. I try to deal with the FDA and find somebody friendly there who will be helpful, and it's just like dealing with a black hole. You're right. That would be a good topic to file some FOIAs over.
Well, here's a suggestion. We're talking to Jane Akre, who started this news service. In 2011, this Mesh Medical Device News Desk, or it's often called the Mesh News Desk. If you have a list of questions that you want to ask the Food and Drug Administration under the Freedom of Information Act, which I helped get through Congress in 1974, we have pro bono attorneys who know how to develop a freedom of information request and can persistently follow up. So if you send me some questions you would like the Food and Drug Administration to respond from their voluminous files of inactivity in this area of mesh regulation, just do that and we'll get it formally filed.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Is there anything else, Jane Akre, you want to tell our listeners by way of being alert, by way of helping themselves if they get into a hernia repair situation or their friends and relatives and coworkers do?
I think it's a good question to ask if the doctor has the skills to be able to do a non-mesh repair, whether it be hernia or pelvic organ. And if they say they don't have the skills and they haven't done those, I'd seek out another doctor. As a consumer, also, you want to ask what the classification is of any medical device that they want to put into you. If it's a Class 2 device, do your homework.
And do you have advice on your Mesh News Desk, tips that people can learn from?
Occasionally, I file consumer-friendly advice along those lines. There's a search bar there, so you'd look up things like how to file an adverse event report with the FDA. It's really important that people do that because as little as the FDA does, it's really the only vehicle we have to communicate with them.
Lastly, Jane Akre, how can our listeners and their friends contact you?
They can contact me through meshnewsdesk.com, also Mesh Medical Device News Desk.com, because we cover other medical devices that are also problematic. And there's a contact number there. Many people call me all the time, and they can email me with their questions. And hopefully they'll use the search function on the site and learn about their medical device, their mesh, and go from there.
Thank you very much. That's meshnewsdesk.com for a plethora of information on this spreading tragedy.
We've been speaking with Jane Akre, founder and editor of the Mesh Medical Device News Network. We will link to that website at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again today, Dr. Robert Bendavid from Shouldice Hospital and Jane Akre from the Mesh Medical Device News Network. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap-up. Welcome, podcast listeners. We're able to respond to some of your questions in the wrap-up. And here goes. David, why don't you do the honors?
Michael Doremus writes, Ralph, my question is, what are your thoughts about Ben Carson saying that being poor is a state of mind?
Well, Ben Carson reflects an old saying, goes back many years. Is there anything more insufferable than the self-made man? Ben Carson has said that he did it arising out of the slums of the inner city, so why can't everybody else do it? He has said if all mothers were like his mother, there would be no poverty. The point is that that's not the case, that people grow up in different circumstances. They grow up sometimes in fear. They have disabilities. They don't have strong personalities. They get depressed. They get discouraged. They have bad luck. People along the way don't give them a hand. They fall into a bad crowd. They are worried about all kinds of things because they're poor. So the question is chicken, egg. When you grow up poor, you grow up very often with severe damage to everything about your environment. And I think that Ben Carson now has become part of the Trump regime. He came out of a heavily commercialized medical practice where he was a brilliant surgeon, a pediatric surgeon, and he doesn't have the empathy that's required. Now, there is a kernel of truth about what he said, which is to the extent that human beings are able to, they have always got to try to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And they've got to have higher expectations of themselves. And they've got to be able to find people who can help them. A lot of people in poverty just are not in that position. And we've got to recognize the vast diversity of human capabilities, human disabilities, human psychologies, and develop a social safety net that not only supports them from descending further into the depths of their despair and deprivation, but supports them in terms of their own finding ways to exercise self-reliance.
This question is actually kind of along the same lines because Myrna Valdez says, address the USA prison population job situation upon their release and the rise of homelessness and opiate use due to inability to reintegrate into current society standards?
Well, as most people know by now, we have the highest prison incarceration rate per capita in the entire world by a huge margin. And the millions of people who go in and out of our prisons help keep the unemployment rate down. When they're in prison, they're not considered unemployed. When they get out of prison, they find that there are a lot of stigmas attached to their prison stay. Number one is they have trouble getting credit, trouble getting loans, trouble getting mortgages. Number two, they're discriminated against by potential employers who are not of the mindset that they paid their dues to society, and more so often, especially for nonviolent crimes, and they deserve a second chance. And then there are all kinds of other programs that discriminate against what are called ex-felons. And imagine they're coming out of prison and they want to get on a sustainable path, and they're up against all of these stigmas, including personal stigmas of people they meet and people who whisper behind their backs. So we got a long way to go before we can emulate the public policies of prisoners and ex-prisoners that prevail in Scandinavia and Holland and Belgium. Much more humane, much less recidivism going back into the jail, and much less destructive lives as a result. Why can't we learn from these countries? Because, of course, we're number one in the world, right? Who's going to ever teach the United States? Well, we're now like 35th in infant mortality or 20th in wages, and we are way down on the list of the World Health Organization's index of health care. There are dozens of countries that are ahead of us. So we better get a little more humble in order to learn from better practices in other countries to make our own country better.
Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming either on Ralph's Facebook page or at the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website.
For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org.
And if you're interested in visiting the American Museum of Tort Law this summer, please go to tortmuseum.org and check out the Tort Museum bookstore for engrossing books and memorabilia.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph. We'll talk to you then.
Thank you, listeners. Be informed as a patient before you go to a doctor. An informed patient with the right questions will become a safer patient.